Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week is what's North Korea's involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and what should we expect from it?
Hello, my name is Bruce Bennett. I work at the RAND Corporation. I'm a senior defense analyst. My focus has traditionally been on nuclear weapons, and I'm in my 50th year of working on that. But over the last 35 or so years, I've also worked on Korean issues and focus in particular both on North Korean threats and on South Korean security.
That's interesting. And especially, now that North Korea has kind of re-entered the scene and has started sort of terrifying the world from a new angle now by cooperating with Russia. Oh my gosh, sorry, that was my dog. Uh, sorry, I'll just Finishka, please. I'm working from home today for the first time in forever, and they're really not liking it. Sorry. Um, okay, so since North Korea has entered the scene in kind of like a newly terrifying way for the world, and I guess increased its presence in the world of military and warfare, specifically helping Russia with Ukraine, how much of a threat do you think North Korea is in their realm of Ukraine and their involvement in Ukraine?
Well, I think that North Korea sent an initial increment of troops, about 10 to 12,000 to Ukraine. It certainly sent considerable amount of artillery shells, but also some launchers. And there had been some expectations that we would see huge deployments of North Koreans over time, much more than the initial 10 to 12,000. Instead, it appears that there've only been an increment of about another 3,000. That tells me that it's a modest change in the threat, not a huge change in the threat posed against Ukraine. Still, modest threat changes can be important in terms of vulnerabilities or other things it can open. And certainly the artillery that North Korea has contributed to Ukraine or to Russia have been really a substantial difference in what Russia's been able to do. So, is it a huge difference from what would happen without North Korea involved? Maybe not huge, but enough to make a difference in the conflict? Yes, absolutely.
I wonder for North Korea, though, right? Obviously, they do get partnerships with Russia and they exchange intel and they also exchange weaponry, and there is this nuclear situation that we're all aware of. But so w let me paint a picture, right? We all pretty much understand that North Koreans don't leave North Korea. So North Korean troops have never been out of North Korea. Now, the troops that we have seen coming to the battlefield in Ukraine are uh, the least prepared troops that could probably come from North Korea onto the Ukrainian battlefield. Why do you think that is? Is that because they're not expected to return, or are they basically disposable?
Yeah, good question because it raises a critical issue.
Hmm.
As you may be familiar, North Korea has a political caste system.
Yeah.
That's a system that divides people based upon their loyalty to the regime. And at the bottom, you've got the hostile class, then you've got the wavering class, and then you've got the core class, the
Yeah.
elite. The special forces, especially, but maybe all of the troops that North Korea has sent are from the elite class because Kim doesn't want to take a chance on people who are wavering who would likely defect in if they were deployed to Russia. That raises a real quandary for him because in North Korea, the elite families, most families, only have one son. And if that son is killed, then that's the end of that family line. The posterity is gone. And people don't understand that in Korea, the historical culture is very family oriented. So many of those families of elites in North Korea are losing their posterity, and they're going to be furious. And that's going to cause Kim some internal problems. So that helps explain why he hasn't sent 20 or 50 or 100,000 troops. He can't afford to. And that also answers another part of your question, because if those troops who've been in Russia are returned to North Korea, well, they're going to be able to tell their family and friends what happened to their buddies who were killed because of poor Russian use of those troops, using them as cannon fodder, that sort of thing. And that's only going to make those people even more furious at the regime. So this is a case where it's entirely possible that most of the troops sent to Russia will never return to North Korea. Officers, perhaps, to bring back lessons from the war, but the enlisted, probably not. And we never know for sure. Now, you also have to ask, when the troops first arrived, they really weren't prepared for the battlefield in Russia and Ukraine. Um, they just didn't have any such experience. Well, North Korean troops have occasionally been deployed to Africa against insurgencies, some things like that. But the kind of high intensity warfare that's being experienced in Ukraine and Russia, they had no exposure to that kind of thing. And so they didn't know what they were doing. That said, these were highly trained troops. The typical North Korean soldier who's drafted serves 10 to 15 years if he's in the elite forces. So these aren't guys who were just drafted a year or two ago. And as you see, they've adjusted their tactics, their approaches, and been a much bigger problem than had been anticipated from their initial problems, because they were well trained and they adapted and learned.
Yeah, because initially, I mean, that's actually a very interesting bit of information because initially, obviously, well, first of all, I remember watching interviews with North Korean POWs and them saying that the weapons that they are using in Russia are not the weapons they have ever used in North Korea. They're too advanced, which is also kind of comical in a way because Russia uses kind of resurrected Soviet relics. So that was an interesting bit of information. Another thing is a lot of them did defect and a lot of them did kind of like march over to the AFU to surrender because A, they're not used to the terrain, to the intensity of the warfare climate. It's overwhelming. And secondly, they were given smartphones to communicate, which is, a device that they have likely never experienced without limitations. So there were obviously a couple of jokes that turned out to be true in a bunch of Western media of them engaging in some adult videos and just generally, registering on Tinder and all of the. There was a lot of quite funny. What you would expect from a teenager who had just first gotten a hold of the internet, right? So it is quite uncanny to see that they're they're advancing and adapting, but this bit of information does make a difference and does make it a lot more comprehensible because at first, obviously, when they just first arrived, it was kind of a we say it, in Ukraine we have this saying and it's called circus on a rope, you know, kind of like a circus that's not going right but also going right because it's entertaining. So it's that's what it looked like in the beginning. But what it does kind of tell me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that while Russia is struggling with its military and with its strategic planning because they need North Korean help, is that how does making Kim send his troops influence Russia's ability to conduct warfare, and what does it tell you about Russia's military abilities and their mobilization and the amount of personnel that they have, and whether how it's going, basically?
Well, the Russians have suffered incredible attrition in their forces, and they've wound up using new conscripts with very little training on the battlefield. They are cannon fodder. because they just don't have much experience. Um, the North Koreans didn't have much experience initially with the kind of battlefield they were thrown into. But in terms of discipline, in terms of commitment, those are things that they had been well trained in with years of experience in North Korea. And as a result, they've appeared to be far more proficient than the Russian conscripts at accomplishing many of the missions, more innovative. I mean, they are special forces. They're used to getting behind the lines and that kind of logic. And so they have been a much higher class threat than the typical Russian conscript once they adapted to the battlefield that they were operating on. And they still have occasional glitches as they run into new things they haven't previously experienced. But yeah, many things like cell phones and so forth. Now, they do have cell phones in North Korea, but they're very limited in terms of what they can access, and they cannot access, in most cases, the international internet. It's not something they're given access to. So yeah, they've had quite an experience in Russia with things that they had never seen before.
Yeah, I'm sure it was I don't know if you remember the movie Fifth Element, but it's a very old movie. I think it's from the 80s, and it basically shows a character who got into the future and they're flying cars and all of these things, and she's just kind of surrounded by it, and obviously it's overwhelming. She's kind of having a panic attack. She doesn't know what to do, right? She doesn't know how to speak, and she doesn't recognize anyone's attire or anything. So I would feel, I think that, well, at least in my head, this is how I picture the experience of your typical North Korean kind of entering, a democratic world, or, well, Russia is not necessarily democratic, but let's say a world with developments that are available to the wide public. Um,
Yes.
how reliant is Russia on a North Korea partnership? Not specifically the military, but their shell exchange and the help that North Korea has been providing Russia with weapons. And also, how feasible are those weapons, right? Because there is also something that was happening in the beginning of North Korea sending shells to Russia, where some of them, well, not some of them, but like 30% or something were misfiring. And now that problem doesn't seem to be as pertinent. So what changed there? How? And does Russia need this to continue in order for them to be able to conduct war in Ukraine?
Well, the North Koreans follow the Russian concept of military equipment. You build a bunch of equipment, then you build a bunch more, then you build a bunch more, and you put the old stuff in storage and you build a bunch more. And so that's the basic principle. So while much of the North Korean artillery from the 50s and 60s had been sent to other places, the reality is a lot of those initial shells that they were sending out were from mid 70s into the 80s and so forth. These were very old artillery shells that hadn't necessarily been stored in ideal locations because most of the storage in North Korea is underground. And there's going to be water leakage, there's going to be all kinds of things, and that's going to have made the shells unreliable. That's just the reality of what the world was seeing. As those have been exhausted, and they've turned closer to more recent production or even current production, the quality has improved considerably. It makes a big difference. But it also raises an interesting question. Has North Korea given up its ability to invade South Korea because it no longer has the artillery that it needs? And the answer is it may have given up a good part of that ability. You know, Kim was willing to sell that, suggesting how desperate he is for financial resources, but also for Russian technology.
Mhm.
It's very clear that in the beginning of his cooperation with Russia, Russia wasn't giving him everything he wanted. They were giving him selected things, satellite technology, some things like that. But he wanted much more, especially military technology that's more sophisticated. And Russia was being very careful with that. He apparently concluded that the way to cut loose those technology transfers was to provide the artillery that Russia needed, but that also gave him some financial resources that allowed him to deal with his internal instability. And, when you don't feed people in your own country, you've got instability.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that Kim has also been trying to fight.
Well, speaking of instability and kind of resources and financial resources to change the situation in North Korea on the surface, I don't know if you are allowed or willing to comment on that, but I've recently seen influencer programs for Irish, English, and whatnot, Western journalists, or like I call them TikTok journalists, right? Being invited to go on tours of North Korea to kind of revive the North Korean tourism. But how does that work? Provided that it's a very closed-in society and there is obviously a lot of monitoring, and we know that in the past, right, like there have been people arrested for political gain, obviously from different countries based on like recording something they were not supposed to or going somewhere where they're not supposed to. How is North Korea trying to renew their tourism with huge restrictions? Because, when you bring in a group of influencers, it's one thing, but if you're trying to actually renew tourism a little bit, it's harder to monitor a whole bunch of independent people trying to explore on their own.
Well, this gets to the question of what's Kim trying to accomplish? What's his strategy in the broader sense of strategy? Um,
Mhm.
we don't know for sure. Historically, with his grandfather and his father, the strategy was they wanted to build up militarily to the point they could invade South Korea and conquer it. Um,
Mhm.
Kim seems to have changed his mind. And as best I can tell, his strategy now is let's insulate our country. Let's build an iron curtain around North Korea because
Mhm.
we want to keep information out. And let's build up militarily so that we can coerce the outside world, but not necessarily have to conquer it,
Mhm.
because if they sent their troops into South Korea, they would suffer a level of ideological contamination that would probably end the regime.
Yeah.
So Kim seems to have adjusted his objectives. We don't know for sure, but that seems to be where he's going. Key to that, though, is he's got to break the ROC US alliance. If he can break the alliance, then he can dominate the peninsula coercively. And that shows in the opinion polls in South Korea that show that with nuclear weapons, the people believe that North Korea is militarily superior, which is a little weird for most Americans to think about, but that's what the polls conclude. So Kim wants to break the alliance, and he's taking a variety of actions to make that happen. Um, and I think that's where he's headed. So this is not quite the world that we've dealt with in the past. This is an evolution of his approach, his buildup of nuclear weapons and so forth. Kim isn't trying to build 40 or 50 nuclear weapons. Kim appears to be, from what he said, to be building hundreds of nuclear weapons. Now, that will take time, but that's where he seems to be going because he wants to have enough that he can be an effective coercing power, not only against South Korea, but against the US and against China.
Yeah, well, this particular bit is also interesting because obviously, similarly to Russia and similarly to the Soviet Union, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the second largest and the second best military in the world really did show its true colors, because when you can have a controlled authoritarian regime, you don't necessarily tend to put people in power that are your mailmen, sort of, or your information men who will tell you the truth. You have people in power who are scared of you and want to tell you what you want to hear. So we don't necessarily know how well. I mean, parts of it we do know because we see North Korean military in Ukraine, we see their shells, and we see all of that, but we don't know what the capacity of their production is like, what the quality of the product is like, because at the same time they could be sending their best stuff to Russia. We don't know that. As in, there is no way to check, and I don't even think Kim Jong-un knows himself what level his military is developed at and what level it isn't, because let's face it, who wants to deliver bad news to a dictator? No one. Especially a dictator who is building up his red button capabilities. How does that coordinate with South Korea? Because so this is not a theory per se, right? But South Korea is the only country in the world at the moment that could probably completely substitute for American military help for Ukraine if it wanted to. But obviously, right now, it does not have any strategic or political reasons to do so. However, it is capable of doing it because I think a lot of the people in the world actually don't realize how powerful South Korean military actually is and how strong their innovation is. Um, how does all of this and the magnitude of North Korea's partnership with Russia influence South Korea's policy and politics towards Ukraine?
Well, so you have to be careful with the strength of the South Korean military.
Hmm.
Is it strong technologically? Yes. Is it as advanced as the US? Well, not quite in most areas. They're still their most advanced fighter is the F-35
Hmm.
from the US. Though the new KF-21 that they're building is not a bad alternative at a much lower price. So they come in typically at a niche just below the US at a much lower price. The problem South Korea has is the size of its military.
Hmm.
North Korea's military is maybe 1.2 or 1.3 million men.
Hmm.
South Korean military is now somewhere in the neighborhood of under 500,000. That's compared to 700,000 that it was 20 years ago. Uh,
However, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do
sure.
want
Oh,
to ask
no,
you
go
a question.
ahead.
But every man who turns 18 is supposed to serve in the South Korean military. So technically, do we mean 500,000 or just under 500,000 currently serving under contract? Or, because the population of every man is technically militarily trained for, I guess,
Well,
years or something like
Mostly, yeah. I mean, there are alternatives to South Koreans. There's a conscientious objector tract. Some people who are sufficiently wealthy can get their kids out of it. Um, but
that.
uh, but by and large, most men serve in the military. Problem is demographics.
Hmm.
South Korean demographics started going bad 50 years ago.
40.
Right now, they're getting zero point 0.7 births per woman per lifetime. I mean, that means the size of your population is contracting severely.
Hmm.
They're going through a major downturn in the size of the roughly 20-year-old age cohort. And their military is continuing to decline in size for another, 2 or 3 years till it stabilizes for a while and then starts going down again. So they've got very detailed demographic statistics. Their problem is in part demographics. Their problem is in part politics. The draft period for South Korea used to be 3 years.
Hmm.
Then they lowered it for the army to 2 years. Then President No Myung set it up to decline to 18 months
Hmm.
for the draftees. Uh, President Lee Myung-bak back in the 2010 timeframe froze it at 21 months,
Hmm.
and then his successor on the progressive side lowered it to 18 months.
Hmm.
So part of it, and the progressives have said, oh, it's not really any big deal when you reduce the draft period.
Oh,
Not true. You cut it from 21 months to 18 months, and you're getting rid of about a sixth of of your conscripts. And
Yeah.
conscripts traditionally have been about 300,000 troops, so that's about 50,000 personnel. So part of it has been a political change.
Yeah.
There's now talk of going to an all draft army. Well, an all draft army has two problems.
Hmm.
One, I'm sorry, not all draft, all volunteer army.
Hmm.
All volunteer army has two problems, and the U.S. wrote extensively about that before they went to an all volunteer military. First problem is not everybody's going to want to volunteer. And your second problem is many of the current volunteers are what are called draft induced volunteers. They volunteer because they'd rather be a volunteer and choose their service and choose their specialty than to be a draftee.
Hmm.
And you go to an all volunteer service and you lose those draft induced volunteers. So while the size of the South Korean military has shrunk to under 500,000, it could well go to 200,000 or less if they went to all volunteer. And even at 500,000, it's probably too small to go into North Korea after a North Korean invasion of the South and stabilize the North. It's just not large enough to do many of the things that would be associated with the South Korea-led unification.
Yeah, I mean, in less academic terms and in more sort of like social terms, right? I do have some friends in South Korea, and so when you said that the population rates are declining, I was actually studying this issue, and at some point I asked my female friend what the problem is, and she said men, because the South Korean women are unwilling to reproduce with South Korean men because they just they created this movement called For B movement. And as to the military draft, that actually surprises me because I do have another friend in and obviously in North, no, not North Korea, South Korea, and obviously that's just anecdotal evidence or anecdotal, but he's from one of the quite powerful South Korean families, and his dad, in fact, insisted that he put his American studies on pause, come back, serve in the military, and then come back to NYU and finish his degree. Because they're quite traditionalist and an old school family, and there is like, the man of the family and the son of the family. They do have more than zero point 0.7 children per per woman, but that is a rarity. I was quite confused when I found out how many siblings he had. But yeah, that's a very interesting insight sort of into South Korea in general, not just militarily, but politically and socioeconomically, right? Because while there are all of these population rates declining, they're still quite, I would say that they're advancing in the field of like technology and things like that. And when I did say about them being able to replace America's aid to Ukraine, I don't necessarily mean in terms of technology fully. I more so mean in terms of numbers if they wanted to, because Europe, for instance, even if they wanted to tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to do it. But I feel like South Korea has been waiting for a North Korean for a North Korean debacle for so long that they do have all of their production ready and going, and they do sell quite a bit of military equipment. I'm just wondering, like, their politics towards Ukraine, how does that change with the larger and larger involvement of North Korea in the Russia's aggression towards Ukraine? Does it change at all? And does it pose a threat to South Korea in a way?
Well, the South Koreans have, for a variety of reasons, been reluctant to offend Russia.
Hmm.
They don't want to do that, and therefore they've stood back. Now, that said, it's also important to understand the U.S. is now talking about shifting the attention of our military forces to China, and even the forces in Korea shifting towards China, and as a result, turning over to South Korea more responsibility for covering the defense against North Korea.
Mm.
Um, Amidst the time when the South Korean military is declining in size. So this is a big concern of the South Koreans. They're strongly hoping that U.S. troops don't get pulled from South Korea, and that may well they may well be helped in that regard. We don't know for sure that the troops in South Korea will be reduced. After all, being in South Korea is one of the best places to defend against China. Um, and the South Koreans have about a 90% dislike of China among South Korean people. That it's kind of
Understandably,
interesting.
China is not allied per se, but favorable of North Korea. China is never allied with anyone. They're just kind of, it's black market deals in a way, under the table deals. How does all of this, I guess like kind of some of my summing up questions are, how does all of this impact global stability and security? And also, how is the West reacting? Whether it's enough, how should it be reacting? And should we worry about the United States' role in this? Because you just mentioned the United States and South Korea needing their troops stationed, right? But we have kind of a rogue person in office right now that we can't predict their actions or rely on them because I mean, we don't really know whether they're going to wake up in a good mood tomorrow or in a bad one.
Well, and the South Koreans have been concerned about that since well before the election last year. They know that President Trump, in his first administration, had demanded a substantial increase in what's called burden sharing, the money that South Korea pays for U.S. troops in Korea.
Hmm.
Um, there is a certain fairness to that. The U.S. spends a lot of money on the capabilities that it provides to Korea, not counting the follow-on forces that are trained in the U.S. and kept in the U.S., but would flow to South Korea in a major conflict situation. So, you know, has President Trump uh, insisted upon an unfair division of financial responsibilities? No. He's really tried to go to a fair distribution of financial responsibilities. That's hit our European allies, that's hit our Asian allies hard. Um, but the reality is, it's time for things to be done more fairly. And the U.S. can't bear the burdens. Part of the problem the U.S. has right now is if any major conflict develops in the world, it's not clear we have the military forces to handle one military conflict, one major conflict, let alone two or three simultaneously, which could happen. We just logistical supplies and so forth are potentially an issue. The size of our forces, have been declining in recent years. So these are issues which this administration's taken a different view on, and it does. Our allies are unhappy, and and wish we would be prepared to do more for them, which we have for decades. That said, we really don't know the current administration's policy towards Korea. They haven't taken a strong policy. Um, in part, that's because the South Korean president was impeached, and nobody's known for the next few months who's going to be the new president.
Yeah.
And June 3rd, there's an election. Immediately, then the winner is put into office. Um, and so I think the US administration right now on Korean policy is waiting to see what happens in that election in how to proceed. Because as much political turmoil as in the US, there's far more in Korea now between the liberals and the conservatives. And so, not really a good idea for the US to get too close to one side before the outcome of the election. And so the US has properly kind of stood back and said, look, Korea, you decide who your leadership's going to be. Once you have, we're going to be happy to work with you, but we're not going to alienate both sides in the process.
Gotcha. And as to global security and the global actions towards this?
Well, the global security, I think many Americans have been disappointed that the current administration has stepped back from Ukraine. I think President Trump was very clear that he expected that he could get a rapid resolution of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. He did not count on the deception and bad behavior of Putin. Um, Putin kind of made it look like he was prepared to talk and come to some kind of resolution. And then every time that the U.S. made compromises, he stepped back and wanted more. Um, I think President Trump is now getting that and realizing that Putin is not cooperating toward an end of the conflict in Ukraine. Whether that will adjust President Trump's approach to providing aid to Ukraine, don't know. It's possible because he seems to be getting more and more distressed with Russia.
Mm,
So we may well see some major adjustments to U.S. foreign policy, U.S. defense policy over the coming weeks and months because Putin failed to be the kind of cooperative partner that I think President Trump had hoped for.
mm. Yeah, I mean, coming from Ukraine, I'm not surprised that President Putin has failed to be a cooperative partner. I don't know what the Trump administration sort of was hoping for. I guess they thought they were special, but there is no one really special when you're dealing with a bloodthirsty dictator who just wants territory. I think he also thought that the Trump administration is special and that they are gonna let him off without any sort of punishment, which we have yet to see. But thank you so very much for this very enlightening conversation. I, for one, really enjoyed it, and I'm now going to be looking up a lot more things about North Korea.
But good luck.
Thank you, and I hope to see you here in the channel again soon.
All right, happy to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I certainly learned a lot of new information, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on all of your notifications if you want to see more conversations like it. Also, of course, like this video, share it, and if you have anything on your mind, please drop it in the comments down below and I'll read it. Till next time.